Hi everyone. I thought it would be nice to kick off season 3 with exploring my cosmology, and I really felt like the Spherepoint architecture really deserved like a little bit of a longer form content video. So, this architecture, alongside some other very fundamental things I pull from, are sort of the basis of how I define the infinite nature of reality and our infinite 3D universes, but the infinite 3D universes part specifically was something I called a sphere point. And my cosmology is meant to be like a skeletal blueprint. You can find the link in my YouTube description, but it's meant to be something that you can apply to pretty much anything and everything in the world, in the universe. And season 3 will be a lot of exploring and checking to see whether that's true. Before I begin, my cosmology is on shivohamlabs.com. It's in the tab called Frameworks, and it'll take you to this page right over here. And you can just click on Read Framework, and you'll land on this page. So I have embedded my PDF. It's called the Recursive Generative Vach or VAC model. But once again, only focusing on the sphere point architecture today. And at the bottom, there is a place where you can leave feedback, such as how good looking I am. So please use that. All right, let's get started. So, why did I select a point, circle, or a sphere? So if you're trying to describe the totality of the cosmos and everything, I think that a sphere, a circle best describes that. Also, when we talk about the universe, we talk about it from the source being a singularity, like an infinitely dense point. So why not continue working with that? And it's where there is undifferentiation, totality, unity, consciousness, everythingness. There's no privileged access, and there is maximal symmetry. So everything is represented with that same level of sameness everywhere. And I'm not saying that everything necessarily has to be this perfect circle, sphere, or point. I don't think such a thing technically exists in material reality. So that this is very architectural. It's meant to be something that kind of comes, quote unquote, before the Big Bang, and also to describe everything within a material universe. But I would assume, in a material sense, things would be a little bit more amorphous. And I also, in future videos, will talk about terms such as cycles, cycle completion, and samsara, which in Sanskrit talks a lot about the cycle of death and rebirth. And we typically link that to human life, but there is a life to everything, every subsystem and supersystem in our cosmos as well. So it's kind of the perfect shape to work with. Also, like with anything you have in the universe, you could probably put a circle or like a sphere around it and contain it within that. So great shape for that. All of these diagrams are in my cosmology as well. I just kind of copied and pasted them in here. So this sort of started with the journey of wanting to understand a point, a simple point. It also started with me having the question of how are there things that are truly 2D, 1D, or 0D? Because if you were to really get that granular and zoom in onto anything, everything would reveal some level of depth and dimension that you just couldn't see at the scale you were at before. So I made it super duper simple, and I thought about the concept of going from a point to a line. And the way I sort of thought about it was you have a line that's small enough for you to look at it very easily, but if this line was infinitely long, naturally you would be the one to apply the vector, like you would look left to right. So you're implicitly, subconsciously already defining that trajectory, hence this arrow right over here. And the question in all of this sort of was just how would a dot know to have a line here. I mean, mind you, we're a little biased because we're in 3D land, and so we're watching this on a 2D screen. So everything's already kind of cut out for us here because the space in which these diagrams are made are in 2D for me to represent this information to begin with. But that's okay. I mean, we can conceptualize the issue anyways. So, how does a dot go to a line in this way with the arrow pointed in the right direction? What about in the up direction? And then this one over here is meant to describe the z-axis. Once again, just thinking about 0D to 1D. All right, so we know that 2 points make a line. And if there's a dot turning into a line, where's that second point coming from? Well, coming back to the concept of zooming into things once again, if I take that point and I zoom into it, it actually has both the 2D shape and the 1D shape. 2D because this point turns into a circle, 1D because every circle's got a radius. And this radius, we know a radius starts out from the center of a circle and then comes out. It's also half the diameter of a circle. So here's the radius. And I'm basically saying in order for this arrow, this bigger line to be here, there is a point coming in from, there's a line coming in from this point already. It's just not as easily, once again, at our scale, not as easily visible. So there are also multiple points on the circumference of this circle that may be getting selected, right? And based on that, you get the direction from the smaller points radius, which is like here a circle, and then it turns into actually this 1D line for, there's a smaller line and a bigger line. Another thing to think about is this circle right here at the circumference, this dot, if you zoomed in, this whole thing would repeat again. Like this too, zoomed in, is also a circle. And there's like the infinite selection process of going in that direction. The same thing is or would be happening here in the y-axis. And when I'm describing things on a screen is 2D, but let's conceptualize working on the z-axis, right? If I'm pointing diagonally or like towards you on this other plane. And I'm just talking about 1D here, but as you can see, just simply by zooming in, we see 2D, but by rotationally moving around, there already had to be the potential of 3 spatial dimensions to exist in order for this 1D line to go in the direction that it's going in. This was the beginning of me starting to link a point to being a sphere. So when you zoom in to a point, like, depending on how and where you're looking at it and how you continue to become aware, so hold on to that word, aware you become of these different vantage points, naturally 3 spatial dimensions will be discovered. So when we're working with 3 spatial dimensions and we're talking about a sphere has 360 degrees. I think we should just slow it down and go back to the basics and ask ourselves why that number to begin with. Technically, a circle's just a circle. You could divide it into 10 parts, 1,000 parts, 40 parts, 66 parts, but 360 degrees is efficient, clean, and convenient. This goes back to like ancient times when people would look up at the stars and try to capture like how many steps complete like a total solar cycle, the Earth going around the sun. And that's where we have our 365 days from. The ancient Babylonians had a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics. So instead of rolling over after the number 10, you roll over after the number 60. So we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, and 360 is divisible by 60 as well. So you have a circular clock and then circular time and all that. And 360 degrees, the number, has a ton of divisors. Look at all this. So you can divide it into so many different parts and be super clean and even. It also represents completion in the degree system. It's not like you can't have more than 360 degrees. It's just 360 degrees is when you would return back to the exact same point. Beyond that, though, you would just keep rotating within itself. So 360 degrees just represents completion. And as per my cosmology, it's the number and the shape and the form and the architecture I'm using to talk about how a point, and in our case, and how I'm talking about it, the singularity, leaves itself, self realizes itself via traversing all directions and engaging in creation, development, diversification, differentiation, and then all of those aspects get resolved and then return back to itself, the point. And this is what I am using to describe the journey of our beautiful universe from start to finish. If you guys remember the unit circle, unit here is just like the smallest unit, 1. So here are the numbers on the x and y axes of 1, 0, 0, 1. And, this also goes back to your basic 3, 4, 5 triangles. Even before people had a sophisticated shape like this, I mean, there were people architecting cathedrals, people plumbing, people just building and measuring in basic life. And even before we have formal names for things, it's all about how we embody the philosophy of 360, of like moving forward and back, side to side, up and down. And those were aspects we needed to use to sort of create. So we had to understand what parameters we were working for this type of creation. And 90 degrees here for a right angle is not just some arbitrary number. It really could have been, I mean, any kind of number, but it's just the first idea is independence. And what I mean by independence, when you look at like being purely on the x-axis, you see in the unit circle, the value here is 1, 0, 1 for the x value, 0 for the y value. And on the y-axis, it's pure. It's a pure y. So 0 for x, 1 for y. So what about these other values over here, where you're part x and part y? So the idea is if you're moving up just the y-axis, there's no part of the x-axis involved. But if I'm pushing something sort of in this direction, you're also moving along the x-axis. There's an influence of both. Once again, this all is from the vantage point that you start with. Like, it's not hardcore set in stone necessarily this way. Like, you could take this circle and sort of rotate it a little bit more. Once you choose where the first x-axis is, where the first axis is in general, 90 degrees represents what becomes an independent force after that. Sine and cosine just describe relationships between the x and the y-axis together. And I know that we're just talking about a circle here, and I'm talking about a sphere for my sphere point, not a circle point. But that's because to really understand the dynamics of one plane affecting another, you don't really need to involve the z-axis. The cosmos math, everything that we have that's brilliant is clean and efficient. So 2 axes is the minimum needed to maximize the idea of what orthogonality is. And now when you take something on this plane and rotate it, the same principle applies on the next plane. Here's also a diagram from my cosmology. I'm not going to hit every single part, simply because I do bring up the concept of samsara here and recursive storytelling and creation and consciousness. So we're just going to stick with the architectural portion for now. I've also already covered how everythingness is described as 360 degrees. And I kind of have these arrows over here to sort of delineate, like, why is it 3 axes, not 5? and it's about independent forces. And also, when I was talking about symmetry earlier on for why use a sphere, this is what I'm talking about. So if you look at image 1 and 2, as soon as you introduce a line in this direction, you're implicitly also showcasing its other side. The concept of other side really just comes from the center, but this line could just go on and on and on. And the same thing too is like for 3 and 4, basically I'm talking about like an expansion that's happening. There's also implicitly like a duality involved. And that duality is sort of showcased here. I'm not going to go so hardcore into the concept of duality. That also applies to early universe cosmology, how things exist to begin with. Our universe is just full of dualities. So when we're thinking about the first duality, it's an interesting concept that maybe it could be a spatial dimension, because once you have, whatever axis, and I intentionally made this diagonal because when we think of x-axis, we think it has to like look perfectly this way, but in all reality, it just starts anywhere. You can start anywhere, but like the next axis you choose has to have that 90 degrees for that pure independence. And what's so fun about this is with just a line, you have just a line. But once you have your second axis, I like that you not only have you created a left and a right, but you've also created the concept of an up and a down. And beyond the three axes, we can't find another pure 90-degree angle. And once again, a lot of these things, before they're fancy and diagrams and equations, they're all embodied first. So you can kind of use your materials, use your own body and rotate and move and see if there's any more independence that you can really find. It's also why we just talk about time being the fourth dimension, something beyond that. And really, the game of finding three spatial dimensions is just boiling down to three independent forces, like the minimum number of forces to create the maximal level of a dynamic conscious reality that can recursively create from within itself and is experiencing itself, can have self-awareness. So when I think about the singularity as a point, and then I think about our universe also kind of expanding infinitely as a sphere, well, also we're infinitely expanding, but we talk about our universe having a boundary. And I'm talking about it as my cosmology as a pre-skeletal, or a skeletal structure, sorry, pre-material. So if this happens to describe our universe, and this, let's say it's like captured in a moment of time, then yeah, who's to say that we are also not a sphere point on a super sphere's radius along one of its three axes? Right? And so there could be these universes in front of us, behind us. We have parallel universes. We also have perpendicular. We have them in all sorts of different directions. And we sort of focus on this one. And I really believe in the micro and the macro mirroring each other. And I believe in an infinite reality. And I'm determined to prove that. So the question's always going to be, why stop here? Why is this all we'll ever know? Even if we discover the secrets of the universe, is this the only universe? And then look, these super spheres too, they're also on their own axis of a super sphere, super duper sphere, that has its own radius, and it's a line with a lot of points on that line, and it goes on and on and on. It just never ends. Another aspect is, after understanding the structure of a sphere point, is the behavior that can happen within a sphere point, the dynamics of it. I have sort of a skeletal structure here and then the pimple version over here. But you have your X, Y, and Z axis, and depending on where you decide to pause and take a look. And I want you to like also challenge yourself here and think about what I mean when I say that, because a line can go on indefinitely. But like when we're choosing to look at a place, something that is continuous, we have now discretized it. We've gotten into a snapshot. And that snapshot is dependent upon the observer, because this line, it keeps going on. But in the diagram, I as the observer and you too as the observer, we've decided that we're going to put the arrow here as a place to stop. You can kind of stop anywhere. So here we have like basically this same thing rotated and placed over here. And this same thing once again rotated and placed here. And so it just kind of goes on and on and on. It sort of looks like a tree branch. And I think that's a great way to sort of describe it too, is like a decision tree of sorts in what direction that we're going in. Mind you, these are all orthogonal, right? Like this is supposed to be 90 degrees here. And this is my best representation of trying to make a z-axis, but that, there would be a 90 degrees there. So you might be wondering, well, hey, if you're like trying to talk about all the directions something can go in, why are you going fully orthogonal with the perfect x, y, and z? Let's go to the pimples, to show that this is like the space of everythingness that dynamism can occur in. So it's to set the stage for the three necessary components to build everythingness within. So we can observe activity within like an all-encompassing container. Excuse me. So this is just a small look into it. A point that's a sphere at like stage 1, when you start looking at, as you expand, how it works, it's like, well, where else can I look when I rotate? And how does that affect what I'm able to see at this point? And that's why what you're seeing are smaller and smaller spheres, because it's not about like size here. Size was just the limitation of being on a computer and how I describe this information, but it's really about trying to share that every place you go into becomes its own realized universe. And once again, like I said, everything is meant to be applied to everything, not only in the world, but in the whole universe. It can also be used to apply in the structure of our cells, particles, molecules, everything from the macro to the micro. 3 aspects of a sphere point. Number 1, the center. Another diagram from the Cosmology. So if we have a sphere, we have a center of the sphere, but we know that every point is also a sphere in and of itself. So as we zoom in to the point here, and I really wanted to depict this as a point, but I also wanted people to see that there's aspects to it that are beyond just a point. But when you zoom in, it's another sphere, and this sphere also has its own center. And then if you zoom into that center point, that too is a sphere. So what does that tell us? That these spheres at the core are infinitely dense. I know dense is kind of a strange word because density implies mass, and we're talking about pre-material infinite 3D universe architecture, but it's just potentiality, latent potentiality that exists in this shape. Keeping in mind that, like, I'm just trying to explain to us humans that need to have the concept of a boundary beginning and an end, because we only see things as far as we are, or we see ourselves. But this sphere could go on and on and on. 2, the filling. So not the center, but everything in between. Not my it was my attempt of trying to show that here with the X, Y, and Z axis, there's lots of activity with infinite points in here that are also spheres when you zoom into them. So, I mean, this is just dense at the center and everything in between just big and heavy. and it looks like it's just a solid block of color, but upon examination, you will find potential for infinite universes within the fill too. Final aspect, the boundary. So even at the boundary, there's infinite points. These infinite points, when you zoom into them, also become spheres. When you go back to like the very first diagram of going from the 0D to 1D point, if I took that principle, and this is how I'm doing this presentation, I could take the principles of like one part of the slide and then apply it, and then the next part of the slides plus the first part of the slide, first part of the presentation, apply that to everything next. It's all like compounding. So also all of these points, they're infinite points. They too are these spheres, and they can be, they wouldn't necessarily be like perfectly right next to each other, right? Because if there's the radius of one sphere and the radius of another one, there's also like one point sort of close to the end of one sphere, and that too, if you were to examine and zoom in, could become its own sphere point. So all of these three aspects of a sphere point can be applied to one another. And for the rest of the presentation, I want you guys to think about how the center, the fill, and the boundary of these sphere points I'm describing, like it all applies to all of the scenarios I'm going to bring up, which makes it pretty trippy. Okay, so remember when I was talking about the infinitely like kind of close points at the boundary, and I had that diagram about there's our universe and there's parallel and perpendicular and all around, and there's a supersphere, and the superspheres are within a super duper sphere, right? And so our universe, that's like a spherical amorphous type of shape, singularity was a point first, if we're thinking in linear space-time. Well, that point could have been on the line of another supersphere. The radius. Radius is a line, and a line needs minimum 2 points. If this is our universe, these could be the other points. And if we zoom into them, these points are spheres. But if we take a look at the boundary of one ending and another beginning, what really decides that? I mean, I personally don't really, I mean, I have an idea. Well, I'll explain in future videos, but there's points there too that are infinitely dense, and they could even be their own sub-universes, operating at a scale and size and parallel time, or not. We don't know, because maybe we don't have the ability to access it. Maybe it's so close to our universe that we don't really notice it. And when I think about things in the universe existing, I think about the data structure of a hash set that only unique items could be allowed in. So keep that in mind for one of the future diagrams I show. That's just on the x-axis of this supersphere. There's also the y-axis. And the idea is that our universe that we're in has a material. That material is ether. Maybe it's like some type of fluid. I mean, I will begin to explain more in future videos like what that could be, and maybe the mechanics and physics and consciousness aspects of that. So what I'm once again describing here is something without necessarily a realized material skin to put on the skeleton, but this is sort of the idea. So once again, our universe is just kind of on that line to give you the perspective. We were looking at the x and the y-axis. There's a z, but there's also like every other degree that you could take a part in too. And they don't have to be just like 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degrees. It's 1 degree. And aren't there infinite points between the number 1 and 2? 1.00001, infinitely repeating 1, 1.0000, infinitely repeating 2. Those angles. And then in between those, there's infinite values. All sphere points. This diagram I have is called grab anywhere. So remember when I was bringing up the whole unique hash set idea, And it made me think like, well, if there's and I've always had this idea, I think for like 10 or so years now, that like multiple or parallel universes, they were kind of in some way running on a line. That's how my brain conceptualized it. And the closer the lines were to your universe, um, the closer to your universe's laws of physics and material reality it would have. But if a point is so infinitely close to you and that too can be realized as a universe, then like if I have a sphere over here, if you just look at me, and then there's like one, think of like a 3D Venn diagram almost. And it's just like ever so slightly to the right. There's another one ever so slightly to the left, ever so slightly to the back, ever so slightly to the front, ever so slightly up, ever so slightly down, right? And then there's like maybe in all of those directions 0.000 infinitely repeating 1% difference. But there's this huge overlap. So it just made me think like there's discovering the point into being a sphere, but then there's also maybe some subtractive force potentially that could be going on out of just efficiency, depending on where you're grabbing from. At this level, when you're thinking so architecturally, it really does become philosophical. It really does become based on the observer and what they're looking at, where they're looking at it from. That's why this is called grab anywhere, right? Like, so if you really just pull from one place, maybe what you grabbed was infinite sphere points and you just decided this was the singularity you wanted to work with. It could be anywhere. Here, 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 wherever you choose to select, but everything already exists. So what I guess defines what set of sphere points are infinitely densely packed and selected to create the one that is realized in our material universe. And that's why I say viewing serves as selection. And the additive force is zooming in infinitely and finding the center, but the subtractive force is how you are able to find the maximum uniqueness of infinite sphere points within the selection region without those extreme overlap redundancies. So how is the sphere point necessarily created? Once again, even from our perspective, when we're thinking of the words created and destroyed, it's because our material life was created in the womb and will be destroyed when we die. So that's us operating in linear space-time, following the laws of thermodynamics and entropy, but something beyond space-time, before material, before entropic time, purely in generative time, without having consequence, being able to like look at things in scale, right? Like if I'm at a point at time t equals 0, and then I zoom a little bit at time t equals 1, and I see a circle, and then at time t equals 2, I sort of rotate the circle. Like, is that time really happening per se, or is it about how awareness is able to zoom in and capture that data? And did that really happen due to the course of time, or is it because the observer taking a look at this data is naturally limited by its experiential frame rate and can only look at things like sequentially? Fun stuff to think about. Coming back to our pimples, so if you take a look at like a simple line over here to the right, and you keep going right here, and you keep going right here, it goes on and on and on and on and on. It can look a little bit like that. So not only do we have infinitely dense centers and filling and a boundary, but even the vector, even a direction, any selection within a sphere point. And now I have these concentric circles, but really I'm just blowing up their centers a lot. So basically what I mean is, for this circle, this is meant to be its center, but I just blew it up within itself. But this is supposed to be the center, and then this circle here is meant to be this circle center that I blew up, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually representing multiple centers all blown up within one circle that's also a sphere. And they're all infinitely like pointing in this direction. So you keep going, and this also goes back to our very first diagram too. So it almost feels like in order to go in any direction at infinite scales at the macro and micro level, it's all choosing and selecting that direction too. So we'll take that concept in a step further. So here, if we like have this line, we could say that line is represented here. Let's say at a random point we just grab anywhere and we select this sphere. So we can move anywhere in these 360 degrees. We choose this direction. But like I was saying earlier, a line can go on and on and on. So really, when does something stop? I guess maybe when you realize it never stops. So the observer, awareness, sort of has to choose where stabilization occurs. Things are still going on and on and on, but depending on, I guess, where you snapshot, you will have path traversal. So here, that idea exists. So I did the same thing again, this whole sphere. What I did was wherever this magenta line stopped, and this magenta line can represent anything. It can represent looking. It can represent movement. It's just the skeletal idea of direction. Okay, so it stops, and where it stops at a point, right? Beginning, end. Okay, and we know a point is also going to be a sphere. So it becomes realized, and I take this bigger one, I place it here and slightly rotate it. So if you like kept rotating your laptop and everything this way, you would see how I rotate the sphere at every place these vectors stop. So what this is sort of showcasing is path traversal from, now this is already a sphere, but what should be implied throughout all of this stuff is that this is also a point realized as a sphere. And to think about the term realized as well. We'll touch on that in the later aspect of this presentation. Okay, so I mean, these were all points, right? Like I said too, even for this, wherever you stopped, it stopped at a point, but that point also has the potentiality. And I'm not necessarily suggesting the shape has to stop here. It's just the limitations of my MacBook, of my screen. But this sphere, infinitely large. I'm just deciding where to stop here to contain the decision that happens within. And so you can kind of keep going on and on and on. And that's what I mean when I say infinite 3D universes. It's also the opportunity to see that this is like, we're still talking pre-material, but what about within the universe? Well, once again, a skeletal thing, if you can apply it everywhere, this would represent a greater system, and then you get into a subsystem. That subsystem has its own subsystem, and it subs on for however amount of time. I mean, this could represent your, I don't know, your stomach. Then within the stomach, there's other biology things that exist within a stomach, all the way down to cells right over here, right? You get smaller and smaller, so you're like, where you zoom, where you look. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, definitely leave some questions and comments so I can articulate this better. All right. Another way you can kind of represent path traversal is by looking at infinite dense points. They're so close to each other on the center, the fill, and the boundary. And even at the center, fill, and boundary, there's those points, and those are spheres, and they have their center, fill, and boundary, which also have all those infinite points that have their center, fill, and boundary, and it goes on and on and on. So it wouldn't look like a bunch of dots. I mean, it's so dense everywhere that it would just look like a solid block of color. And I'm just choosing like two universes to sort of show that like there's something in here, and that's why I've made their centers that solid block of red color. So the way you have path traversal over here, like if let's say we'll say that maybe this universe here is represented by this universe here. And if you wanted to get to this universe here, right? Maybe you look at it like this. So maybe the path traversal is like something like this. I mean, it ends here, moves in here, 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 right? And like this potential for these spheres to come into existence all exist already. It's just about where the direction goes, where the selection process happens. And this would represent the path to go from one to another. Arbitrary size decisions made here. There's no like set scale of how it would work. But these bubbles, this thing that looks like Coca-Cola right now, it already exists. Observing and deciding to focus on a point and zoom into it grows that into that sphere, and it all exists within its infinite potentiality. I've spoken a lot about observation. It's time for me to come clean about my beliefs. It's that awareness is fundamental and self-awareness is emergent. And this Spherepoint architecture I intend on applying to even the standard model of particle physics and all aspects of early universe cosmology, so stay tuned for that. But let's get into some really crisp definitions that we'll keep using. Number one, this comes from my cosmology as well. Awareness, the capacity to hold or view information, potential for infinity here. An extremely basic, possibly non-representational field. But of course, we need to represent it somehow so we can talk about it. Consciousness, interiority that awareness can have. Subjective experience, qualitative feel. Self-awareness, consciousness capacity to form understanding of its own states, which creates the ability to self-model and self-reflect. So if we're talking about awareness, there's your solid block of color. That's everything that could ever exist. But the reason I want to talk about consciousness is when we think of consciousness, you know how like spiritual people will bring up your frequency, and frequency, when you think about modulation and sound, it's an oscillation. There's movement. Okay. Well, I wanted to say consciousness was fundamental, but there's a little nuance here that we have to consider. And the nuance is if everything is happening all at once, even past, present, and future, and that's me in my 3D limitations thinking that the fourth dimension is outside of us, there's no laws of physics to be had. Physics describes dynamism and experience. What's there to experience if everything is happening all at once? Like this. So if you want consciousness, what I've sort of surmised is consciousness looks a little bit more like this. Consciousness is path traversal and movement. There's a differentiation between where it is and where it is not. That's how experience happens. And as human beings, that's why we have an experiential frame rate too. For us, we have our 5 input parameters, our 5 senses, and cosmic data comes in, and based on what our evolution, creation allows for to maximize experiencing what we need to for our survival and thriving and minimizing the amount of things that we need to perceive. So even like with the visible light spectrum, it's what's visible to humans. We don't see everything the way other animals might. But we can only experience reality one bit of experience at that frame rate at a time. because this reality is this like insane level multidimensional thing of struct metadata struct, and we can't experience what we do at time t equals 0 and time t equals 1 and time t equals 2 at the same time. And we have consciousness. That consciousness is a result of path traversal and engagement, movement, that which is and that which is not. That wraps up everything for the Spherepoint today. Save this video. I'm going to refer to this a lot. I created this because I also owed the people a deeper formality, because I keep repeating the Spherepoint term again and again, and it would just be easier and cleaner if people knew all the dynamics and aspects of it. And put your questions down below, put your comments down below, so that I can be a better support in helping understanding the architecture of my cosmology. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.